Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're glad you're here for today's webinar, The Science of Carbs, Unraveling the Spaghetti. I'm Greg Berry, Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. As a disclaimer, as with any virtual event, occasional technical hiccups may occur. If you experience any video or audio issues, simply click reconnect or refresh your screen to return to the presentation quickly. Let's kick things off with a quick poll. Before we dive into the science, let's go ahead and have a little fun. If you are hosting a dinner party and can only invite one carb as your special guest, which one gets in? Is it pasta, always dressed to impress? Bread, warm and comforting? Rice, versatile and dependable? Or potatoes, the overall crowd favorite from time to time, it seems. If you had to ask me and if push came to shove, this is going to be a tough one, but I'd probably go with pasta. Go ahead and select the one that best fits your dinner party. Today's session is the latest in our The Science of webinar series. The series has become one of our most popular, and we're excited to have you with us today. On your screen, you'll see a lineup of past The Science of presentations. Each one dives into fascinating topics and features incredible experts. If you'd like to explore the series more, head on over to alumni.uab.edu/science series. Today, Dr. Tara Kelly is back for a third time, all part of our Science of series. She was part of the second installment during the Science of Hunger 4 years ago, and this past May, she joined us for the Science of Sugar. She earned her BS in Nutrition and Dietetics and MS in Nutrition Sciences from East Carolina University. And since then, she's been become part of the Blazer family even more so, earning her PhD in Health Education and Promotion from the School of Public Health. Now, before tossing it over to Dr. Kelly, here are the results of our first poll. Drum roll, potatoes and bread. 28% chose each of those for their dinner guest, with pasta getting 1/4 of the vote. Now, before we kick things over to Dr. Kelly, a little more on the serious side. How often do you eat foods like pasta or bread? Daily, a few times a week, rarely, or never? Your responses are going to give us a chance to better understand our audience, and we'll have more poll questions coming up at this time. Dr. Kelly, welcome back.
Thank you, Greg. I'm so excited to be back, and I'm excited to be talking about this topic since it actually really nicely builds off the last Science of presentation that you had me here for. So thank you very much for having me back.
You're so welcome.
So I'd like to start by saying I don't think that you can go wrong with any of those choices for your dinner party guest. I would be happy with any of them coming to my house for dinner, and they are all part of my regular diet. So I would say that they're all part of my regular family dinners as well.
See, rice for me is 6-7.
Oh, really? Okay. Just a little 6-7 there. I like what you did there. All right, well, thank you again. And let's go ahead and get started with the topic for today. Again, the science of carbs. So I do have some learning objectives for you all. I am an educator here at UAB, so I can't help it but start you off with some learning objectives. But just to go over these very briefly, what I'd like to do today is first go over what carbohydrates are. So just general definitions, make sure we're all on the same page about what we mean when we say the word carbohydrate. But then we're going to go more into what the recommendations are for consuming carbohydrates and some actionable items for you all to take away with you today so that you can be choosing healthy sources of carbohydrates in your everyday diet. But again, beginning now with that definition. So what is a carbohydrate? Well, a carbohydrate, when we say that word, we're really referring to a nutrient. And more specifically, a carbohydrate is of a group of nutrients that we call the macronutrients. Macro meaning big. So if you've heard macro in other contexts like macroeconomics, for instance, macro means big, and big in the sense that it makes up a big part of our diet. The macronutrients are carbohydrates, protein, and fat. So these are nutrients that contribute significantly to our body's calories and the energy that we get from calories and other bodily functions that are able to occur because of these nutrients. Carbohydrates specifically are our body's primary source of energy. you get about 4 calories or 4 units of energy per 1 gram of carbohydrate that you consume. But not all carbohydrates are created equally. There are multiple different types of carbohydrates, and generally these are categorized into 2 separate categories: simple sugars or complex carbohydrates, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. But first, I wanted to ask you all another poll question of my own, and that is, true or false, carbohydrates are one of the 5 main food groups. So if you don't mind taking a moment to answer that for me.
I'm very curious to see which way this goes. And right now it's 100%. Well, now it dipped to 50-50. But you hear about different things. So I'm really not 100% sure of the accuracy of what I would have thought. I don't think so, because I want to say grains and starches and etc., but I could be completely wrong.
And that's exactly why I'm starting off with asking this question. And I should say really how I framed this entire presentation is based off of some of those common questions and sometimes misconceptions that we have about what carbohydrates are. As a registered dietitian, and in my role as an instructor in the Department of Nutrition Sciences, I will say there are a very short list of topics that I'm most frequently asked about, and one of them is carbohydrates. So the topics that I've included in this presentation are some of these common questions compiled together, and this is one of them. I think we can go ahead and end this poll, because it looks like it hasn't moved in a bit. So, are carbohydrates one of the main 5 food groups? The correct answer to that is false. Carbohydrates are not one of the 5 main food groups. They are, again, a nutrient. So as a nutrient, you might find them in food groups, but they're not actually considered one of the food groups. What a lot of you might be thinking of is what Greg was alluding to, is our grains. Grains are considered a food group, which means a class of similar foods that they're all grouped together in that one category of grains. So with that, let me ask you one more question before we move on. Based on what I just said, which food groups actually do contain carbohydrates? And you have a couple of different options here. Could it be grains? Is it fruits and vegetables, dairy, protein, or all of these?
I'm going to admit this one completely stumped me. Grains, obvious, just because of breads. From there, I honestly don't have a clue.
Yes, and that's where, so if you think that it's grains, the correct answer could be grains. If you think it could be grains and something else, then there might be another answer that's the best possible response option here. And it looks like, I think most people have answered this already too. Yep. So we'll go ahead and point out that most of you have said all of these, and that is the correct answer. It might not seem like it, because I think that most of you, if you're looking at this and thinking all of these, really even protein contains carbohydrates, well, it does. All of these 5 food groups actually do have some foods in them that contain carbohydrates. Now, that's not to say that every single protein does contain carbohydrates, but there are specific proteins that do. So what are our main sources of carbohydrates in the diet? Breaking it down from that food group perspective. We see carbohydrates, of course, in our grains, like we've talked about. So we'll see it in all those dinner guests that we could possibly invite: our bread, pasta, potatoes, rice. So any cereal grains or any byproducts of those cereal grains. We do see carbohydrates in fruits and vegetables. For vegetables, you'll see them in any vegetable, but particularly those starchy vegetables are going to be better sources of carbohydrates, like potatoes, as we mentioned, as one of our dinner guests. And again, proteins, you can see carbohydrates in the protein food group, but specifically it's going to be in those plant-based proteins like our legumes, like our beans, peas, and lentils are our legumes in that food group. And lastly, yes, dairy. Dairy contains lactose. Lactose is the main sugar that's found in milk and milk byproducts, which is our dairy food. So you do see carbohydrates in dairy. So let's look at how this occurs a little bit more closely by getting a little into the chemical structure of carbohydrates, because this is, after all, the Science of series. So I want to get a little bit into the science with you all before we go further. So when we look at the chemical breakdown of carbohydrates, all carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. And when these atoms all form, they form what's called a simple sugar unit. Then those simple sugar units can actually join together to make longer chains. And when they form together to make longer chains, they make different types of carbohydrates. And when we talk about carbohydrates and we're categorizing these, they're actually categorized by the number of these simple sugar units, the simple joining of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. So the different chemical classifications that we can have for carbohydrates are our monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. When we break these down into categories, they're more broadly referred to as our simple sugars and our complex carbohydrates. Now, I will say today in this presentation, although we are talking about the science of carbs, I'm more specifically going to be talking about our complex carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates, as you can see, are those that are made up of more of those simple sugar units joined together. So again, simple sugar units is just starting with one unit of the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygen atoms all joined together. One simple sugar unit would be our carbohydrates like glucose and fructose, which you would see in a lot of those fruits and vegetables of our different food groups. Disaccharides is when we have two simple sugar units joined together, so two monosaccharides that are joined. And those are found in foods like our milk products. As I mentioned, lactose being the sugar that's found in milk. Lactose is a disaccharide. But once we get to our complex carbohydrates are made up of much more of those simple sugar units joined together. For oligosaccharides, you can have between 3 and 10 monosaccharides joined. And for polysaccharides, you have much more than 10 monosaccharides all joined together to make up this carbohydrate structure. Our polysaccharides are where we see our starch and fiber, which is what we'll talk a lot about today when talking about carbs, as these are the most abundant carbohydrate in food. And now I'm not just talking about our polysaccharides mostly today because of their abundance and how important they are, because certainly simple sugars are very important to discuss and cover as well. But as we talked about in the introduction to this webinar, I presented on the science of sugar in May earlier this year. So if you are curious to learn more about sugars more specifically, there's a full webinar that goes much deeper into the science of sugar, where I'll talk more about those simple sugar units. So I do encourage you to go and view that if you leave this webinar and are curious to learn more about sugar specifically. But now looking again at those complex carbohydrates that we're going to focus on today. So first talking about starch, and we'll also look at fiber, because again, today I want to leave with some actionable items for incorporating these into your diets. So starch is, again, a polysaccharide, and it's comprised of two different fractions, our amylose and amylopectin. And this is found in any plant-based food. So anything that comes from the ground, grown in the ground, is going to have some kind of starch in it. When we think of starch, you probably are thinking of those cereal grain products, so things that make up our breads, pasta, rice, actual cereals. We call it a cereal grain, but that's different than cereal is made from these cereal grains like wheat. But our starches are also found heavily in any starchy vegetables like potatoes, corns, and beans. Again, any plants or plant-derived foods. Starches, we'll talk a little bit more about how they break down and the function in the body in a bit, but just for now, know that our intestinal enzymes can break down starches. So when we consume these, they do get broken down. And when they're broken down, they're broken into that simplest forms. We can use them for energy in our body. The other polysaccharide we're looking at today is fiber. Fiber is different than starch because while it is edible, because of course we're consuming it, I'm sure you've heard at some point in your life the importance of consuming dietary fiber, which I will definitely reiterate for you today. But when we consume fiber, it's edible, but it actually doesn't get broken down by our intestinal enzymes the same way as starches do. And because of this, most of the dietary fiber that we're consuming, it has to go out of our body after it's come in from the food that we're eating. So this is what forms the bulk of our stool, which is where dietary fiber is so commonly associated with being good for intestinal health, for regularity, and preventing constipation. But like starches, our dietary fibers are also found in all of those plant-based products, so cereal grains and produce, legumes. Also, nuts and seeds are going to be great sources of dietary fiber. I should have included that in the text, but you can see them in one of these visuals on the slide. So carbohydrates, again, all can get broken down to that simplest form, specifically when we're talking about our starches. So polysaccharides, as we looked at before, is comprised of up to 10 or more, significantly more of those simple sugar units all joined together. When we consume these, our body is going to break down these simple sugar units so that they're separate entities. And then that simple sugar itself is at that one unit is going to be converted to glucose within the body to be absorbed and then used as energy for all of our bodily functions. Everything is converted to glucose because that's our body's preferred energy source. That's just how we're wired, is to convert everything to glucose to use that for fuel. Particularly our brain and our nervous system prefer to function off of glucose. So when everything gets broken down, it's down to that simplest monosaccharide and converted into glucose. Now, while fiber does get broken down, it doesn't get broken down the same way as starches do to be used for energy. It'll get broken down a little bit once it gets to the large intestines, just to make its way through the full digestive process to exit the body, again, to be formed into stool, which is what helps maintain our bowel regularity. So now that we have some foundation on what a carbohydrate is, what carbohydrates are made up of, looking at the chemical structure of them, the different types of carbohydrates. When we say the word carbohydrate, we're not just talking about bread, or we're not just talking about pastas. We're talking about all these potential simple sugar or complex carbohydrates that are within these food products that we're then consuming. But now let's look at this in more of an application perspective. So knowing this information now, how can you apply this to the foods that you're consuming and, again, your everyday diet? I like when we can apply things so it's applicable for you as good takeaway messages. And along with this, I'm going to have us look a little bit at food product labels, since a lot of these byproducts of carbohydrates we see are packaged food products. So let's start first with the consumption recommendations for carbohydrates. The dietary reference intake is what outlines basic dietary recommendations for American consumers. And the recommendations for carbohydrates, like the other macronutrients, are a range of percent of calories that should come from those macronutrients. For carbohydrates, it's recommended that between 45 and 65% of your daily calories should come from carbohydrates. And the reason that this is again, because carbohydrates make up the majority of our energy. So the reason there's a range here, though, is everyone's needs are going to vary significantly depending on a number of factors. So what your age is, what your sex, height, weight, and then activity level plays a big part here as well, because how active you are is going to determine how much energy you're burning. So then, therefore, how much energy you need to consume to support the amount that you're expending through your activities. So dietary fiber now is not done as a percentage, but it's done more so as the grams that you should be consuming in a day. And this is based off of the amount that's been observed that is associated with reduced risk of coronary heart disease risk, because this is one of the primary benefits that we see with consuming dietary fiber, is it does help to improve heart health and reduce your risk of coronary heart disease and other heart conditions, which we'll look at in a bit. But just want to note that those are, heart disease specifically is still and has been for decades a leading cause of death in the United States. This is one reason where dietary fiber can be such an important component of our diets. So the recommendation for dietary fiber is that you should be consuming at least 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories that you're eating in a day. And again, everyone's needs are going to be different. Not everyone's going to be eating a 2,000 calorie a day diet, but 2,000 calories is generally what's used as a benchmark when we're talking about recommendations, just to give a frame of reference. Like when we look at the nutrition facts labels in just a minute, you'll see that all of the daily values on the nutrition facts labels are also based off of if you consumed a 2,000 calorie a day diet. So for dietary fiber, if you were consuming 2,000 calories a day, that means consuming 28 grams of fiber in a day. And how are we doing with meeting these recommendations? Well, this isn't showing exactly that information, but I wanted to share this chart with you all today because it helps to get the point across of how we are doing at meeting these recommended amounts. So in terms of carbohydrates specifically, as with a lot of nutrients and a lot of foods that we're consuming as American consumers, we don't have a problem with not getting enough carbohydrates. Most people are consuming more than enough carbohydrates. The problem that we have with carbohydrates, like other nutrients, is not getting our food from the right sources and also not getting enough variety in the foods that we're eating, which is what this chart, again, really nicely shows. And I'm sorry if it's a little small on your screen. I hope that it is not. It's the biggest I could make it, but this is a screenshot coming from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. The dietary guidelines are published every 5 years jointly by the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services. Currently, the next set of guidelines are underway. They should be published really any day, but we're still operating under the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines for Americans. And then the next set of guidelines would be the 2025 to 2030 guidelines. And what the guidelines show is just general recommendations of what we should be eating to support a healthy lifestyle to help promote health and prevent disease. And in this report, there's always data on what we are currently eating in America. So what American consumers are currently filling their bellies with. And this is an overview chart of that information. And you can see here that the top bars, where it's kind of a purplish color with the lines through it, that is when people are eating at the recommendations or above the recommendations for each of the food groups that are shown on the bottom of the screen. So starting with total vegetables, then we have all of our vegetable food groups, and then our fruits, our total grains, our dairy, and then protein food sources. And there's some subcategories of protein as well. So you can see that there's one category in grains where we are going at or well above the recommended amount, and that is refined grains, which we will talk about in just a bit. But when you look at the solid blue lines, which are on the bottom part of the chart, this is where we are below the recommended amount in intake for these different food groups. And you can see we are below the recommended amount for most of the food groups. For our vegetables, for all of the subgroups of vegetables, this is close to 90%, if not above 90% for most of these categories. Fruits, most people are not getting the recommended intake of fruits. For our whole grains, most people are not getting the recommended amount of whole grains because, again, the opposite of that is people are getting more than enough of refined grains. We're not getting enough dairy, and in a lot of cases, we are not getting enough protein. Protein is another one of those nutrients that we tend to consume enough of. We're not just consuming enough variety in protein. So I show this because, as we looked at earlier, carbohydrates are found in every one of these food groups. Even in the protein food group, we have carbohydrates in our nuts, seeds, and legumes that are shown in the very last column of this chart. And since carbohydrates are one of those foods that we know we're getting enough of, people are eating enough of, but we know that there's a lot of different sources of carbohydrates, this chart is very nicely showing how we're not getting enough variety in foods that would be carbohydrate-containing foods. And where this is not a good thing, why we want to work on this is because there are more nutrients than just carbohydrates in these food. or our other macronutrients like fats and proteins. There's a lot of other valuable nutrients that you'll find in these foods that, again, help to promote a healthy lifestyle and help to prevent chronic diseases. So sorry, that's a big chart to go over. And again, I hope you can see it well, but I'm going to move on to my next poll question that relates to this. And this is to ask you how many of the food groups you had in your last meal. So if you haven't had lunch yet, maybe it was your breakfast. I hope you've eaten something today. At this point in the day, I hope you've had something to eat, but there's an option to select 0 to 1 there if 0 is applicable to you.
All right, so I didn't eat since last night and I'm waiting on lunch, so I apologize. But, so I know protein, chicken. I think it was enchiladas. So I think we had tomatoes. Fruit, does that count?
Vegetable, yes, that counts as a vegetable.
We had grains because we had the wrap and we had milk. So I think fruit might be the one that escaped us in that meal.
That's very good to have 4 food groups in a meal. That is very, very good. I would say it's hard for people to achieve all 5 food groups in a meal, but this is something Greg and I were actually just talking about before the webinar began, that this is always a goal that I have in my own household. This is a goal that I share with people all the time, is this is a really simple way that you can frame your eating, is as you're putting a meal together, just to think, okay, what food groups do I have here? And is there a way that I can add another food group to this meal? So if it is pasta, that pasta is the one that's invited to your dinner party, and maybe you decide to make a chicken Alfredo pasta. So you have your pasta as your grain and your protein is the chicken that's included. Can you add a vegetable to that? And maybe you could even have a side of fruit, or if your vegetables a salad on the side, can you put fruit on top of the salad, like little mandarin oranges? And there you just met 4 food groups, have a glass of milk, you had all 5. So it looks like I think most people have finished answering the poll. And I'm really glad to see that so many of you have answered that you've had at least 2 food groups in the last meal that you had, maybe 2 to 3. A lot of people have had 4 to 5. That's wonderful. Another thing I'll say with this is I know it's different for every meal of the day. When I work with people from like a counseling perspective as a dietitian, I find that breakfast is the one that people tend to struggle with adding more food groups in, just because breakfast we sometimes don't know what to do with. But I've included a number of pictures of oatmeal in the slides today, and maybe you'll be inspired by the oatmeal with nuts and fruits. You can make your oatmeal with milk, and that could be a really good, well-balanced breakfast. And I leave this to you today as kind of a first challenge of this webinar, as something to consider moving forward, is carbs are, again, an essential energy source of our body, but we don't want to think about just the macronutrient itself all the time. It's really important to get a variety of sources that these carbohydrates are coming from, because the more variety that you add into your diet, the more variety you're getting in all of the nutrients that are essential for your body's functions, and just really for your body to flourish and thrive, to really be operating at your maximum capacity. And this is why something I really love with the current dietary guidelines is the very brief tagline that they have for it, which is to make every bite count. And what that's getting at is just to think about the nutrients that are in the foods that you're consuming and try to maximize the nutrition that you're getting from the foods that you're putting in your mouth. With every bite, making it count, that you're giving your body the good nutrients that it needs. And that can be done by adding variety to our meals through the different food groups. So another way that we can specifically focus in on making every bite count is talking more specifically about that grains food group and looking at the difference between whole and refined grains. So as I showed in that table that we looked at just a moment ago, most people are getting a lot of refined grains in their diet, but not enough whole grains. So I want to go over briefly what whole grains are as compared to refined grains, and encourage you to try to consume more whole grains into your diet as well, which can pertain to any of the foods we've talked about, like our pastas and rice and breads we've been talking about throughout the webinar so far. So when we're talking about whole grains are, we're talking about our cereal grains. And every cereal grain, whether you're talking about wheat or rice or any of the others, I will today encourage you to try to add more variety to grains specifically too. They're all comprised of the same three components, and that is the bran, the endosperm, and the germ, as shown in this grain anatomy image on the screen. Each of these components contain different nutrients of the grain. And what happens is a grain is considered whole when it's in its original form as it's shown on the screen, in just this anatomical form, that it has the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. But a lot of the grain products that we see on the market, when you go to the grocery store, pick something up, if it's not whole grain, it's what's called refined. And refined is when this whole grain has been altered to take out really typically the more yummy part of the grain, which is that endosperm. The endosperm is the largest part of the kernel that contains all the starch. So all the yummy starch is coming from the endosperm. And when we're changing a grain from its original form to be that refined grain, you are removing the bran, which is the outer portion that has all the dietary fiber in it, and it has some B vitamins, so other valuable nutrients. And you're also taking away that germ. The germ also contains more vitamins and minerals, and you're getting rid of those completely and taking the endosperm, and that's what you're making the bulk of your grain product with, is just that starch. So what you're left with is a grain product that the nutrients have been completely altered. You can see that from this image on the screen right now. So in the middle, you'll see a whole wheat product. This is where the green bars of this bar graph are. This is where the normal level of nutrients might be for something that is whole wheat. And when something has been refined, so that you're taking away that outer portion and the little inner part, the germ, you're taking away so many of these nutrients that, just looking at the first one, vitamin E, for instance, you only have 8% of the original amount of vitamin E in it. So these micronutrients, so many of them are being stripped away, along with, if you look down closer to the middle, you'll see fiber. So you only have about 25% of the amount of dietary fiber that you would have in a whole grain product. And while we're on this slide, I did want to also point out enriched, because this is something that we commonly get questions about in nutrition as well, and it's an important term to be familiar with. Enriched is when a product has been refined, but then enriched to add nutrients back to the grain product so that it's not lacking in some of those essential nutrients. So you can see the yellow bars that are on this graph, that some of those micronutrients are added back, but not all of them. And some of the nutrients that are added back, it's specifically related to public health efforts because of conditions that we're keeping an eye on. A lot of times these align with objectives called the Healthy People Objectives, which are goals over a course of a 10-year period that we want to strive to. So for instance, the bottom two with enriched amounts are iron and folate. These are two objectives for women, specifically women of childbearing age, should be getting enough iron, preventing iron deficiency, and folate, because folate is linked with healthy pregnancy outcomes. So those are enriched in our grain products to help as a public health effort, again, make sure people are getting enough of those. Okay, now let's look at just another quick example. This is the difference between brown rice and white rice. So if you're choosing the whole grain brown rice or white rice, which has been refined to remove portions of the grain, so you just have the starchy component, you can see it's very similar to the whole wheat product shown in the last slide, that you have significantly less of the original amount of nutrients unless you are eating enriched white rice. But even with it being enriched, you're not getting all of those original nutrients that you would be getting from the whole brown rice itself, the whole grain kernel. So why do we want to be eating whole grains? Why is it important for us to try to switch our intake from eating refined grains to consuming more whole grains? Well, there are a host of health benefits to eating whole grains, and these are all very well-backed, well-researched health benefits. As mentioned earlier, it's associated with a reduced risk of heart disease, also stroke, reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. When you're consuming whole grains, you're getting more dietary fiber, and that's linked with better weight management, less inflammation, and lower risk of colorectal cancer. Benefits of consuming more dietary fiber, which you would get from consuming more whole grains. It slows, well, first we have all the health benefits of it. So it's, again, also linked with our heart health, so reducing risk of heart disease. But then just on a day-to-day basis and how you're feeling, it's going to help slow the rate of your digestion and absorption of food, since that's something that's not getting digested like your other nutrients are. So this can help you to feel full for longer. It can also help you to maintain more stable blood glucose levels. And these are why it's linked with better weight management when you're getting sufficient dietary fiber. And then also linked with, again, keeping your bowels regular. And as we saw with whole grains, that link to reduce risk of colorectal cancer as well. So let's look at some of the dietary fiber content of basic foods that you might be eating to show. We saw before you should be getting estimated about 28 grams of fiber in a day, give or take, depending on what your unique calorie needs might be. And really the best way to get dietary fiber is through a variety of food sources by adding a more variety into your diet through incorporating more food groups. So as shown on the screen, I have some fruits that are good sources of dietary fiber, a vegetable. We can also get it from our grains, like from spaghetti and oatmeal. So again, a takeaway of this is just if you are able to add more variety into your diet through the different food groups, then you'll be able to add more beneficial nutrients like dietary fiber, which is a wonderful carbohydrate to make sure that you're getting enough of. Okay, now we're going to briefly go over how to read nutrition facts labels before I leave you with some recommendations to take away with you today. Because nutrition facts labels are another one of those areas that I feel a lot of us are struggling with interpreting, particularly the total carbohydrate section, because there's so many subsections here. So we're just going to look at this briefly. So when you're looking at a nutrition facts label that's found on any packaged food product that you'll get from the store, you will always see this total carbohydrate section on the label, and that's indicating the overall amount of carbs in a food. So including the starches, which are not listed separately on the label, but then also dietary fiber and sugar, which are listed separately on this label. So the way that you read this is this has 27 grams of carbohydrates, and then it has 25 grams of sugar underneath of that. So if you subtract 25 from 27, there's 2 grams left. So the remaining 2 grams that are in here must be coming from starch, because starch is not listed. If there was fiber, fiber would be taken into consideration there as well. But all of this is contributing, the dietary fiber, the total sugar, is contributing to that total carbohydrate amount that you're seeing. There are percent daily values established on nutrition facts labels that are based off of that dietary reference intake that we looked at before. And these percentages that you're seeing, they can be used to help you make more informed choices about foods that you're purchasing. For dietary fiber specifically, if you see that, well, this applies to any nutrients, but just because we're focusing on fiber here, but if you see that there is 5% of the daily value or less of dietary fiber in a food product, that means it's considered a low source of dietary fiber. If you see 20% of the daily value or more, it's considered a high source of dietary fiber. And you can use that for interpreting any of these nutrients, but again, just if you're trying to increase your fiber intake, looking at food labels. So just a couple of examples here. This is looking at 2 different types of English muffins. I love English muffins. So I went to the store and took a couple pictures of the different kinds. The top is a regular English muffin and the bottom is a wheat English muffin. I will note that it's a light wheat. I couldn't find just the plain whole wheat ones. This is the light wheat version. But you'll see the biggest difference in these two when you're looking at the label is the dietary fiber content, that the one that is wheat, so it still contains the whole grain in it, the whole wheat cereal grain, is higher in dietary fiber. It has 8 grams. And 29% of the daily value, which as we just saw on the last slide, 20% or more is considered a high source. So this is considered a high source of dietary fiber, choosing the wheat English muffins over the regular English muffins. So now I want you to practice this, and hopefully you can read this okay. Let me see. Okay, so we're going to pull up another poll question. And this one is this whole wheat bread considered a low or a high source of dietary fiber, or is it neither? And I'll go ahead and point out as you're looking, you want to, again, look at the total carbs. And then under carbs, you'll see dietary fiber. It says 3 grams. And then 12% is the daily value of dietary fiber. I'm just going to read it for you because I know the lighting's a little hard on this picture.
I'm going to play 6-7 again. I'm right in the middle. I don't think it's either, but that's just me.
Okay.
And the poll is all over the place. It started high. Now it's skewing low. So very, very fascinating.
It is fascinating. Yes. That's why I like to do an example and actually practice applying it, because we want to make sure that everyone has this takeaway. So, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say that, so when we're looking at food product labels, the percent daily value for any foods, if it is 20% or more of the percent daily value, it is considered a high source. So since this is 12% of the daily value of dietary fiber, it is not considered a high source, but it's also not considered a low source. It's considered neither. So it just kind of falls in the middle. That's not a bad thing for it to be neither. It's still good that this has at least some dietary fiber in it. You just wouldn't consider this to be a high source of dietary fiber because it does not have at least 20% of the daily value at only 12%. Oh, there's my circling it. Okay, one more thing about looking at labels that I wanted to give you today is this image to keep in your minds. And this is a stamp that you will often find on food products that is brought about by an initiative from the organization, the Whole Grain Council. The Whole Grain Council, one of their big efforts is to try to encourage people to consume more whole grains. And one way is by making us to become more informed consumers. We're making purchasing decisions at the store. And nutrition fact labels, as we just saw from the last poll, they can be confusing. It's not always easy to read and interpret these. So something that the Whole Grain Council has done is they're trying to encourage companies to put this whole grain stamp on products that actually are whole grain, that contain whole grains at different amounts. You can see there's different types of stamps. So there's some that indicate there's 100% whole grain in a product, or maybe it's only 50% or more. But the way that you'll see these on products is just somewhere on the packaging. A lot of times it is close to where the nutrition facts label is. But what I like about this is if you see it on a product, it's a really quick reference for you to know, okay, this is a whole grain. I know what whole grains are now. I know that whole grains has the entire grain kernel intact, which includes all the vitamins and minerals, and it also includes that dietary fiber. So if I'm trying to eat more whole grains, I can pick this product because I know it actually contains those whole grains. The caveat to this, though, is that not every food product is going to have this. So if you don't see it on a product that you're interested in, the next step to do is to go look at that nutrition facts panel. And the ingredients list can also be a really helpful reference for you as you're trying to make decisions about consuming whole grains. I always tell people that you really just have to do this once, or even just once in a while, because once you figured out, I like this product, I know this is a good choice for me as a consumer who's trying to eat more whole grains, who's trying to eat more fiber, trying to add more enrichment to the carbohydrates in my diet. Once you know that that's a good product for you, you can keep buying it when you go to the store. You don't have to do this in-depth look at food labels every single time that you go to the grocery store. It can be one of those things that you do every once in a while when you're trying to explore new products. Take the time to actually look at the details of the product before you purchase. But once you know that you've looked at them, you feel comfortable with your decision, that's a product that's now in your wheelhouse for you to continue buying when you go to the store. And again, you don't have to spend so much time looking at these every single time. So that brings me to my simple steps and suggestions for you all for increasing some of these important nutrients to add more enrichment to your diet. Again, speaking specifically about the grains when we're talking about carbs, but I encourage you to try to eat more of all the food groups in general. So one of the things that we just talked about is reading the food product labels prior to purchasing. And again, this does not have to be done every time. So I strongly encourage you to do that next time you go to the grocery store when you have a little bit of time. And then just know that you have that information for any time that you go subsequently after that. In general, I encourage you to try to make simple swaps to consuming more whole grains. So like we looked at with the English muffins, instead of getting 1 gram of dietary fiber from the regular English muffins, you could be getting 8 grams of dietary fiber and whole grains by consuming the whole wheat version of English muffins, which is linked to a host of health benefits like reducing your risk of heart disease, reducing risk of stroke, reducing risk of certain types of cancers, diabetes, and then the benefits of just feeling full for longer, better weight management, those everyday factors like energy level as well. Now, if you're feeling like you're in a little bit of a rut, maybe you're not even the biggest fan of whole wheat products, you don't like the idea of some of these swaps, you've tried it before, I want to encourage you to try something totally new then. See if you can try a totally new whole grain. If you look at the data on what makes up the majority of our diets, 50% of the world's calories, the entire world, is made up of wheat, rice, and corn. So we have a lot of calories coming from the very same few crops all over the globe. But there are so many crops out there and so many different types of grains specifically. I encourage you to try a new one because you might just find something that you absolutely love. You can go to the Whole Grains Council website that I mentioned before for really helpful information on this. They have an interesting worksheet that's called Whole Grains A to Z, and it's just a full list of all the whole grains out there that you could possibly try. If you haven't tried quinoa yet, quinoa is a good one to start with. It'd be a lot like having rice, but it has a different flavor profile. Amaranth is another one you could try if you haven't before, or teff. Teff particularly is really high in iron and magnesium. That's an Ethiopian grain and it has a lot of rich flavor to it. So that's one you could consider trying. And for increasing our dietary fiber, my recommendations are pretty similar. The one thing I want to mention about safely increasing your intake of dietary fiber is that this is one of those very few nutrients that you do want to increase your intake gradually, so not doing so much so soon. Because keep in mind, dietary fiber is something that we don't fully break down, and it's something that helps to form our stool. So it's a lot related to our GI health. If you aren't eating a lot of fiber, you suddenly go to eat a lot of fiber, you could have some uncomfortable side effects of that, like gas, cramps, bloating. So it's a nutrient that you just want to make sure you're increasing a little bit at a time. But that actually works really well with how we want to make changes to our diet in general, that it's usually more sustainable for us to do small steps incrementally. So for instance, if you're noticing that dinner might be a hard meal for you to make changes to, don't worry about dinner yet. What about lunch? Could you try packing a fruit to go with your lunch every day? That would add in some dietary fiber. Or a snack. If you seem to be in a rut in the afternoon about what to eat, but you're always hungry in the time between lunch and going home for dinner, could you pack something like a fruit to have for lunch? It could be a fruit with something else, like fruit over Greek yogurt, or an apple with peanut butter, or it doesn't have to be a fruit. It could be vegetable. You could have veggie sticks and have that with hummus, and all of those would be ways to add some dietary fiber to your diet. But I would start with just one change for now with this, and then try to increase it more and more over time as you get comfortable with that one change. So my key takeaways for you from today, really the biggest one is all of us need to work more on adding more variety to our diets and focusing more on the quality of what we're eating, not always focusing so much on quantity specifically. A lot of times the biggest, most impactful changes we could be making to our diet is making swaps instead of adding or removing, but swapping things to make healthier choices. So like swapping whole grains in place of refined grains, as an example. Most of us are not consuming enough variety to get dietary fiber into our diets. If you look at the actual numbers, I believe it was about 90% of women and 97% of men are not meeting the dietary fiber recommendations, is what they report in the dietary guidelines. So the vast majority of people are not getting the amount of dietary fiber that they should be getting. So try to increase it slowly, but make some simple changes to swap some foods out to get more variety of nutrients and variety of all the different food groups in your diet. And I will leave you with that. I'm happy to take questions.
Fantastic information as always. I'm going to go ahead and halt that and go ahead and pull up some questions for you. And if people do have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We have a few minutes to kick a few around. What is the dietary fiber versus soluble fiber on the label?
Oh, that's a good question. So it goes down to how the fiber is broken down. We have soluble and insoluble fibers. I would just focus on that dietary fiber when you're reading a label, because dietary fiber is what we're talking about with consuming at least 28 grams in a day. So as a consumer and trying to focus on how much fiber you need to consume, just look at that dietary fiber amount, because soluble is just relating to a broken down form of the fiber.
Is there such a thing as a bad carb?
I don't like to label foods as good or bad. So that's that kind of goes down to my philosophy as a dietitian, but there are certainly carbs that give you a lot more nutrients than others. That's where I do encourage you to go watch The Science of Sugar, because carbs that have a lot of added sugars in it, those are ones that aren't really doing any good for your body. So if you wanted to classify anything as bad, it would probably be something with a lot of added sugar in it. But again, I don't like putting the labels on food of good or bad, because I think it's not part of how we want to be talking about food to have a healthy relationship with food. So I encourage you to think more about the nutrients that are in food and what's going to really empower my body to be strong, to thrive, to have good energy, and flourish every day.
And I did drop that link a while ago in the chat. It's simply alumni.uab.edu/sugar. And go ahead and give that a look.
Right.
What are your thoughts about low-carb eating?
It's going to depend on the individual, what their needs are. Low carb eating is not for everyone. Some people have a need to have low carb, even a medical necessity that they need to eat low carb. In general, though, even when we're talking about low carb, most people are still getting at least 45% of their calories from carbohydrates, so that lower end of the range. But based off of all the data that's out there, that dietary reference intake is coming from, it's the National Academies of Science, Medicine, Engineering. They just lengthened the whole name of it. But that academy, that's where that dietary reference intake is coming from. So that's based off of all the available literature that's out there, the recommended amount of carbohydrates that most people should be consuming. And the reason that there's a range is some people don't need as many carbs. So they should be having closer to that 45% in a day and are perfectly fine. The other nutrients then would be coming from your other macronutrients. So having more fats, having more proteins, but it really depends on the individual. I'm going to give a throw out to say, I would suggest meeting with a dietitian to learn more about your unique needs if you do want to explore that.
Speaking of unique needs, life changes. Since the last time we met, my wife became celiac. And this question is about that. What do you suggest for those who are celiac?
Yeah, so celiac disease, for people who don't know, is when it's an autoimmune condition when your body attacks itself when you consume foods that contain gluten. So you really cannot have any gluten-containing foods. Gluten is going to be found in a lot of grains, but not all grains. There are a lot of grains that are gluten-free. And even just the difference since when I first started studying nutrition and where I am now, there are so many gluten-free products on the market that I'm really encouraged for people that have celiac or any other type of gluten allergy, that you can find really good products on the market to still have a very nourished, well-balanced diet, eating gluten-free. If you do have celiac, especially if this is a new diagnosis, strongly encourage you to meet with a dietitian because it really does help. We do have clinics at UAB too. You can look in the Department of Nutrition Sciences and Family Medicine, so you can find dietitians on campus. But also that whole grains website I mentioned, wholegrainscouncil.org, that whole grains A to Z worksheet, it specifically has gluten-free yes or no on it. So you can see which grains are safe to consume, knowing that they don't even have gluten in them. It's not something where it's not part of the grains makeup because gluten is just a protein that's found in some grains.
Final question. When making something from scratch, how would you count the ingredients?
That's so making something from scratch, how would I count the ingredients in terms of like the calories and the amounts in it?
That's what I'm going to guess, yes.
Yeah, that is hard to do. There's softwares that you can do that. So like one of the food tracking apps is called Chronometer that you can plug all this information in. I don't think most people honestly have to worry about getting that detailed with the numbers and counting though. I do share the dietary reference intake in this presentation to give a general idea of how much you should be consuming in terms of carbohydrates. And then again, with dietary fiber, that recommendation. But what I think is a really even more powerful and helpful resource is to go to the MyPlate plan on the MyPlate website. I had a brief QR code on there and I didn't speak to it on one of my slides, but if you go to myplate.gov, you can find where the MyPlate plan is. Plug in your information and it gives you your specific recommendations based off of food groups. I would suggest to do that because I think most people can have a really healthy, well-balanced diet without getting too nitty-gritty with counting. And I only discourage that because sometimes that can be discouraging in itself to people that like, oh, this is too complicated. I have to log all this information. I don't want to do this all the time. So I give those recommendations again, just so you have the information, but I would encourage you, if you want to count anything, count your food groups and go to the MyPlate plan to look for that information.
Fantastic. I did drop that MyPlate website in the chat. Dr. Kelly, thanks for coming back.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate you having me, and I hope you all walked away with some helpful information today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And just a quick note for today's audience, this webinar was recorded. Once it's uploaded on our website, you'll get an email with a link so you can revisit the session or share it with others. As we close, here are the next 4 webinars on tap through our office in our 2025 series on December 11th with New Year, Better You, Reset the Right Way. Dr. 𝘚𝘱𝘢𝘨𝘚 will share practical strategies for building sustainable health habits in 2026. Then start off 2026 on a better financial foot as we host Budgeting 101 Getting Started with our friends from Legacy Credit Union. Come back on January 22nd for From Stuck to Inspired, Rethinking Your Career Journey through our partnership with Mission Collaborative. And finally, on January 28th, join us for the first in a series of leadership webinars with The Evolving Leader, From Authority to Authenticity with Dr. Alan Gorman. As we wrap up, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps us improve and shape future webinars. Just scan the QR code on your screen and to access a brief survey and share your thoughts. Once again, thanks so much for joining us. And as always, go Blazers.